Hello, Sunday Seminary Online. I am Brennan Breed. Thank you for joining me virtually for this semester's class, which will be focusing on the prophets of Elijah and Elisha. So we're going to go all the way through December with that topic. There is a syllabus you can check with Cassie Waits or on the email that she'll send out. We'll have links to it, so we'll be able to share that syllabus. There'll be links on the syllabus with additional readings, all of them free, most of them coming from a website called Bible Odyssey that I help edit, that tries to give free access around the world to biblical scholarship that is accessible and easy to read. So there are lots of links there that you'll be able to follow along with and read. And then there's also assigned reading from the Bible. Now, thank goodness Elijah and Elisha don't have too much of the Bible to cover. So we'll be reading from 1 Kings 12 about before Elijah and Elisha come onto the scene, but we'll be reading all the way through to 2 Kings 9. So that's, I don't know, 20 chapters of the Bible over the course of, 4 months. So it's a pretty decent reading pace right there, not too bad. So if you want to be able to read along and follow along, take a look, keep an eye out for the email that Cassie will send out with that. If you just happen to be stumbling across this and you'd like to see a copy of that syllabus, just go ahead and send me an email. I teach at Columbia Theological Seminary. You can find me on that website there. So why did we pick Elijah and Elisha as a topic for this fall? Well, partly because of the context that we find ourselves in. 2020 is going to be remembered for a long time as a pretty strange year, but as a year in which our faith was tested in many different ways. Our faith in many different things was tested in many different ways. We are thinking a lot about health and about healing and about wholeness. We are thinking a lot about what we worship and why we worship what we worship. We're thinking a lot about questions about God's power and God's sovereignty. There's been a lot of thinking and talking lately about divisive politics, which we're going to probably see more of as we approach November. And people are talking and thinking about things like conflict and war. There's a lot of questions today about worship and why are we worshiping the way that we're worshiping? What are we doing online with worship and so on? So all of these different changes that have come about in the last couple of months, well, really 5 months or so, a lot of these questions that have been raised over the last few months are things that at least I think the stories of Elijah and Elisha speak to in perhaps some good and helpful ways. So that's why we're going to be exploring this material. I think it's timely, and it'll give us the ability to think and reflect in different ways over the course of the semester about what's happening in our own lives and our own day. So the name of the course, which you can see right there, is Elijah and Elisha, God's Presence in a Troubled Time. And like next week, we'll talk a little bit about the setting, the cultural and historical setting in which Elijah and Elisha found themselves. So we'll talk a little bit about the history of Israel. We'll talk a little bit about the kings and about especially the kings in the Omride dynasty and Jehu and his revolt. We'll talk a little bit about what was going on in that time because every prophet speaks to their own day and age. So if we learn a little bit about Elijah and Elisha's day and age, we can learn a little bit about what that might mean for us today and what their messages might mean today. But before we even talk about Elijah and Elisha's context, the big question for us today is, what kind of prophets were Elijah and Elisha? And what is a prophet? We oftentimes think that answers itself, or that we all know what a prophet is. We don't even need to ask that question. But I think that if we think about the ancient world very carefully and think about what a prophet is very carefully, we might be surprised that there are actually many different kinds of prophets in ancient Israel. And Elijah and Elisha are both of a specific type. And that type helps us to understand them. Okay, so here's just a few artistic renditions throughout history of Elijah and Elisha. Here's a medieval icon with Elisha up there. There you go, Elisha and Elijah. Elijah's mantle, he's kind of holding it down off of the fiery chariot, and you have Elisha here who is reaching up and taking it. The story of the fiery chariot is a fascinating one, and we'll spend a whole day talking about it in this class further on in semester. And up above, you can see Elijah or Elisha healing a deceased young boy. This has been talked about with the term resurrection, but we'll talk about that, or maybe resuscitation, twice in this class, once with the person of Elijah in 1 Kings 17, and also with the person of Elisha. We'll talk a little bit about how Jesus draws upon the symbolism, really, of Elijah and Elisha in his own ministry as well. And lastly, we will, the last little image over here, this is the Elijah and the prophets of Baal. One of the things that Elijah was zealous, and Elisha as well. There's a lot of violence in these stories and some kind of strange stuff. There's also some miracles, like the fire falling out of the sky and so on for the sacrifice of Elijah. We'll talk about the miraculous. We'll talk about the violence that underscores a lot of these stories, and we'll talk a lot about the kind of symbolism that we can see in that conflict. Today we're in a world rife with conflict that is full of questions about healing and death and life. And also, we've got some issues of leadership that we're dealing with right now. And that's a question that above, this kind of Elijah and Elisha handing off the mantle. All these different themes you can see throughout the book. Obviously, Elijah and Elisha were hugely important in Christian culture, and even in Jewish culture, even before Christianity existed. The person of John the Baptist, right, is said to kind of live like Elijah, and he wears clothes that make him look like Elijah, according to the gospel writers. Jesus mentions Elijah, and other people think that Jesus is Elijah. Obviously, today there's a table, kind of a chair left open at the table for Elijah among many Jewish families at Passover and so on. So this notion that Elijah is kind of present and here in different ways, either in the person of Jesus or in the prophets like John, or present with us as someone who avoided death in some way. All of those things are out there in the atmosphere, and those are ways that we engage Elisha and Elijah today. But today, actually, in our class, we're going to be trying to put Elijah and Elisha back in their ancient contexts, at least for now. So, prophets. When you hear the word prophet, you might think of, I don't know, Martin Luther King Jr., or you might think of Nostradamus, or you might think of somebody who tells it like it is. Those are all different aspects of prophecy, you can say. But a prophet isn't just one thing, either in the ancient world or the modern. There, in fact, wasn't even just one word in Hebrew for prophet, which might even be surprising to you. The word prophet is a Greek word, prophetes, which means really to kind of speak out about something. There isn't one word in the Bible that means prophet. There's actually several, and around ancient Israel there were several different words for prophets, none of which were actually prophet, the Greek word, right? That comes later. But I've already said something that might need some explanation, and that is that there were lots of different kinds of prophets in the ancient Near East. I see a typo in this, sorry. Ancient Near East, sorry, that should be ancient Near East. But in the ancient Near East, there were many different kinds of prophets. So this might be surprising because you might think that prophecy is something that is like Christian or kind of Jewish and then Christian, or ancient Israelite then Christian and so on. And how could it possibly be that other people had prophets in the ancient world? This might be surprising, but it's very similar to the question of, say, priests, right? Every ancient culture has priests. Israel didn't have a monopoly on that. Or sacrifice. Every ancient culture performs animal sacrifice. Israel's not different in that regard. What they mean by these things may be different, or what they say they symbolize may be different. But ancient Israel participates in the cultural traditions around which and in which it found itself. This shouldn't surprise us, I don't think. Every people who've ever existed in the face of the world, they learn languages from the people around them. They learn cultural things from the peoples around them. And instead of kind of giving Israel a brand new culture that no one had ever seen before, that was sui generis and they're a completely different kind of way of worshiping or praying and so on, God worked with the people who existed in the ancient world, where with all of the complications that they brought with them, and in the midst of all of the culture that they already had. So when Abram and Sarah are approached by God and told to go somewhere and start a new people, right, and go to a new place, they left a Mesopotamian context. They lived like Babylonian people. They believed the things that Babylonian people believed. When a lot of the mixed multitude comes out of Egypt, along with the freed Hebrew slaves in the book of Exodus, they bring with them a lot of their Egyptian traditions and cultures and understandings of how the world works. Ancient Israel was an ancient Near Eastern people. They spoke an ancient Near Eastern language. Hebrew is basically Canaanite. They brought with them all of the assumptions about how the world works. So if you read, say, Genesis 1, and you're confused about why there's a dome on top of the sky or something, or why there's waters above and waters below, it's because ancient Israel was an ancient Near Eastern people, and they believed that the world was pretty much built the way that other ancient Near Eastern people thought it was built, that there was waters above. That's why the sky's blue, and that's why in the story of Noah, God pokes holes in the bowl above in the heavens, and the water floods down and so on. This is how they thought the world was put together. But other things like priests and sacrifice. Sacrifice was a technology in the ancient world for taking care of problems. We'll talk about that some other day and some other time, but just to say, the kinds of songs that Israel sings, the Psalms, those sound a lot like the songs of their neighbors. Kind of like how Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King Jr., but Martin Luther the Reformer, borrowed the songs around him that people sang in bars and the kind of clubs of their day, and the organ music. The organ was not a religious instrument at the time. It was primarily found where people were getting together and carousing and singing and so on. And he took these kind of familiar bar tunes, these drinking songs, and he put religious words to them. In the same way, ancient Israel sings about their God, Yahweh, which is unique to them, but they use the style and the forms and a lot of the traditions of the peoples around them, and they kind of meld their faith onto the stuff that already existed. I think that's the only way that we can be. We're still doing that today, right? But in any event, one of the sort of technologies of the ancient world, at least how they understood it, were prophets. Like I said, there are lots of different ancient words for these people, but they were people who were understood to have some sort of, not just fortune telling. We tend to think about prophets in terms of like Nostradamus, someone who knows the future or something. It's a prophecy, means it's something about the future. Ancient people did that sometimes. Prophets sometimes said things about the future, but almost always prophets in the ancient world talk about the past or the present. And that's actually a lot of what the Old Testament talks about too. The prophets talk a little bit about the future, but it's usually the near future, the next week or month or year, something that you have some sort of influence over. And these prophets are oftentimes keen observers of the realities around them, and commenting. They often comment on what they see as problems around them. So, in the ancient world, outside of Israel, we find prophets in every place that we go. In Egypt, in Mesopotamia, the Hittite culture, those are the people who live in what's now modern-day Turkey, but they lived there in the ancient world. In Greece, in Rome, wherever you go in the Mediterranean world and in the Near East, North Africa, you find prophets. And what these people are primarily are people who in some way are involved in what we would call the practice of divination. So the big category is divination. Prophets are actually a subset of it. And divination, what that means, it's a word that kind of sounds scary to us, or at least to many Christians, but divination means getting information from the divine world and bringing it to humans. That's the idea, that people in the ancient world all around, including Israel, thought that the gods, or God if you were Israel, but remember they were unusual for thinking that. The gods, most of the ancient people were polytheistic, thought there were lots of gods out there. The gods were trying to communicate with humans, but for some reason they didn't do that by speaking to them directly. They believed that the gods were trying to speak to people through patterns or through phenomena, celestial phenomena like the stars and the moon and so on. So astrology is not a new thing. This is actually one of the oldest things we can find in the world, is that people think that the stars are somehow, and the planets and so on, are somehow connected to their future. In the ancient world, they thought that the gods were trying to communicate through these planets and stars and the motions of them and so on, or like an eclipse or a solstice was a message to try to tell you something. And this is divination, is the practice of trying to get information out from these phenomena. There were other things too that they thought were kind of gods telling you something, like birds flying in certain patterns, like a flock of starlings moving and changing. They thought you could read that like a language. They thought that things like sheep's livers. Right here, this image that you see right over here. This is a model of a sheep's liver, and you see this all over the ancient world, from Rome, from the Etruscans to Greece, to the Middle East, to ancient Israel. You can kind of find some stuff in what was then Canaan or whatever that shows these kind of this obsession really with animal entrails. So in Mesopotamia, this was a storied tradition. Wherever people dig up stuff in Mesopotamia from the ancient world, they find these models. This is a model right here, a clay model of a sheep's liver. And why would they make models of it? You can see they made lines and so on, dots. And there's actually, if you can look closely, there's writing. There's cuneiform writing on this tablet. They dissected it. This is a model of it, right? But they're like showing you the different parts of the liver and they're naming these things so that you can kind of train yourself. If you were a person who's being trained on how to read these things, you could like read animal guts. The idea there is that ancient gods and goddesses wrote primarily on, well, things like the stars I said, or birds flying and so on, but they wrote a lot on animal guts. That was how ancient people thought this worked. It's almost like, you write on paper a lot because it's a really good, easy thing for you to write on. It accepts pencil well or whatever, and it's fairly durable and it's cheap. So this is kind of how they saw the animal guts. It was like a pad for the gods to write on. We know this because they talk about it, these ancient folk. But also they thought that kind of the whole world in a way was like a writing pad for the gods, but you had to be trained to see it. This word above me, Baru priest. These are people who are trained in reading these omens. An omen would be like the message that a god is trying to send you. The Baru priest, these were upper class, elite people in Mesopotamia, and there were other names for these same kind of folk in Egypt and the Hittite culture. So in Mesopotamia, though, these people were generally called Baru priests. So they did this specific act called extispicy, that word above me, where they would open up an animal in sacrifice, take out the guts, and try to read them. Now, what do you mean read them, right? They look like animal guts. Well, what they would do is that they would look for anything auspicious, something wrong, off, deformed, or malformed, or something like that. And then they would kind of look around for like, what's going on around me? Like, what happens? Like, what are the gods trying to tell me? They would take note of everything important that happened that day. And then they would write it down in these big long lists, these giant lists, where they would say, like, if there is a lump on the left side of the presence, which is this kind of like lump on the liver, then the army will win today. If the lump is on the right side of the presence, then the army will lose today, right? Because last time they pulled open an animal and they saw the presence of the liver, it had a lump on it on one side, and the army lost. So they think that that's like the message the gods are trying to send. So in the future, when this thing happens, then that's the god trying to send you that same message. So they would keep these fastidious lists, long lists of all of the things that had happened and the strange things on the animal god. So the priest's job was to memorize all this stuff and try to kind of like spit it out in lists. You can see some of this at work in the Bible. In the book of Deuteronomy, Moses says, don't do this stuff. Don't look at the stars for the future. This is condemned loudly within what becomes the biblical strain of ancient Israelite religion. We know that lots of ancient Israelite people did this stuff because we actually can see it happen in the Bible. So I got something up here that says lots. Those are like dice, the casting of lots. So ancient Israelite priests, according to Leviticus, they have these little thing called Urim and Thummim on them. They're supposed to be the kind of knuckle bones of an animal, which you roll. The ancient Israelite priests had dice on their breastplate that they would take off and roll for you if you asked them for an oracle or an omen. Like, what's the God, what is Yahweh trying to tell us to do? You can see this, like David in the book of Samuel asks a couple times, hey, should I go up and fight? And the priest takes off the Urim and the Thummim and rolls it and says, yes, God says you should go up and fight. And David says, great. So then David goes up and fights. The idea is that God is speaking through these kind of like dice. So the priests actually think this stuff's cool. Deuteronomy, it condemns this stuff loudly. So there was some tension within ancient Israel about whether or not it was okay to follow these kinds of omens. You can also see in the book of Daniel that Daniel's like among these kind of almost like magicians or something, right? That are trying to tell the future in the book of Daniel, especially chapters 1 through 6. So that's another kind of setting where you can see these kind of Babylonian omen readers at work. So all to say that this is like the large, like in the ancient world, if you wanted to know what a god said, you would go to one of these fancy, elite, trained, wealthy, from a noble family Baru priests. These priests also had like the kind of the ear of the kings. They would be able to tell them about foreign policy, right? Are we going to win this battle or not? And so on. You can imagine this stuff would be pretty easy to manipulate and take advantage of, right? If you were a priest who could do this stuff, maybe you'd like, oh, you're supposed to invest in this business, O king. It happens to be my son's business, right? So there's some a cynicism that you can think about this, but also it seems that the people in the ancient world actually thought that there were real rules to this, and that it worked. So even one time they read the stars and they said, well, there's going to be an eclipse, and the king, this happened in ancient Assyria, and the king is going to die. That's what they thought the stars were telling them. So they said, okay, so the king's going to die. What are we going to do? So they made a second king. They took the king's clothes and put it on this gardener and incanted the name of the king over him and so on, and said, you're the king now. And then they hid the real king for the day. And then sometimes they would actually execute these people. But this guy, for some reason, they didn't. And he kind of continued as a second body of the king walking around the garden until he died. So all to say, there's some pretty, it's a very different way of seeing the world than we see it today. And they seem to really fully believe in these things. Okay. That's the context in which ancient Israel finds itself. This idea that the gods write on the world around us and so on, their messages. Now, wherever you go to find ancient stuff in museums, they generally have these kind of fake livers, model livers for people to learn on, for these ancient scribes to kind of figure out what to do with these priests. So here's a little image, by the way, in the British Museum. This is a wall relief from Neo-Assyria, sometime around the year, let's say 700. Here's a Baru priest and his assistant who is holding open the animal, and he's reached in to get the liver there. You can see he's kind of elbow deep in the animal. And he's going to pull out the liver, and he's going to read it and tell the king whether or not they're going to win in their battle or whatever it is. So this was a huge and important part of ancient culture. So there is another group of people, a much smaller subset of people involved in divination in the ancient world. We find record of these people in all these different contexts too, from Egypt all the way to the Hittites and all the way to the Mesopotamian cultures like Babylon. But the problem here is that there's not great records of them. It's almost like these people weren't important. I shouldn't say it's almost like. We can tell these people weren't important. These are the prophets. So remember, the people who read omens in a kind of cultured, educated way, those are those Baru priests and so on. And then there was a second group. If the Baru priests are kind of like reading into patterns they see in nature, this is a very different way of hearing from the gods. The prophets were people who just literally heard directly from the gods. For some reason, it was understood in the ancient world that this was not how the gods primarily communicated. Or that if they did communicate this way, it was risky. It was easy to manipulate. It was easy to fake or something like that, take advantage of, right? So it seems it was rare that a king took these things seriously, prophets. But here's the general idea. There's a little kind of clay, this thing to my side, this image to my side. This is a little a clay tablet that's been rolled out with someone's signature. This is a cylinder seal. So this is kind of like someone's name that they're signing here. And what this shows is a temple. There's kind of like two pillars you can see there with ornate tops. There's a roof. That's a little room, that's a little temple, and there's winged gods on either side kind of protecting the temple and cleansing it. And inside there's a deity who's standing up, and then there's the worshiper who's down below. That's the person whose signature this was. They were a worshiper of this deity. That image of the deity there, that's the cult statue. Every ancient temple had a cult statue, a statue of the deity inside it. Think of like the Parthenon or something, right? So that was every ancient temple had that, the statue of the deity, where the deity wasn't the body of the god, but it was understood to be like a place where the god could manifest in some way. So the prophets were people who would sit at the foot of this statue in the temple and just wait for messages from the divine. And this didn't take much training, much practice. It seemed to maybe have been like a family thing, like people actually train their children to do it. But you didn't have to know how to read. You didn't have to know kind of elite culture. You didn't have to know about governance or military stuff. You're just a messenger. You just receive a message and you go give it. These folk tend to be maligned. They're probably poor. They probably live in the temple. You can kind of think of like Anna and Simeon, these folks who kind of like are these shady folks hanging out in the temple at the beginning of Luke, right? Why is this old woman prophet kind of sitting there at the temple all the time? And she seems kind of strange. And so, like this, you can think of like poor people who hang out at religious sites who are maybe like waiting for God to talk to them. Maybe some people would describe them as not being mentally stable, right? In fact, that's true of these ancient prophets too. These are some words above here, muhum and apilum, that describe these prophets. Muhum is a word from ancient Babylon that describes these prophets, and that word means like crazy person. That's what they would say to mean a crazy person. This person who kind of goes crazy in the temple says that they receive messages from the divine and brings them, right? And apilum is another word for these folks. That just basically means to say something. So these are people who hear and report messages, messengers, in other words. And an oracle is what they would receive. That's kind of the words of the god, right? So the god would say something to them, and they go deliver it. They would deliver it in the voice and kind of the god. So, I am Marduk, the god of Babylon, and here's what you need to do, and so on. And in order to receive these messages, they would tend to go into what's called a frenzy state. Now, this sounds bad to us or strange or whatever, but it was actually a pretty common thing in the ancient world. And actually, lots of cultures around the world still cultivate this state. It seems to be a natural part of being a human. Everyone has this from time to time. A frenzy state sounds like you're like frothing at the mouth, but really a fugue state is another way to say this. Have you ever been driving somewhere and then you got there and then you kind of realize I wasn't there? I don't know how I got here. I don't remember my drive. Or walking somewhere and you kind of just wake up and you're like, I don't remember the last 20 minutes really. You were in a fugue state. And we're told not to, like, that's weird and that's bad and that's dangerous, and so we tell our minds to shut off, like don't do that stuff. But if you lived in a culture that told you, hey, that's a gift, that's a good thing, exercise that, stretch that out, it's possible to embrace fugue states and frenzy states and to kind of develop them. It seems to be just a normal part of our human brain. This was also understood to be the state that people went into to receive messages from the divine in the ancient world. So people would get into this kind of otherworldly state sometimes by spinning around like whirling dervishes, right? Rumi, the famous poet, would spin and spin and spin and spin, and then he would speak these poems, right? And he says, God put them in me. He was in a fugue state or a frenzy state when he would make his poetry. So you can get into this state certain ways. Sometimes by drinking. Some ancient kings and queens, they say, yeah, I gave him some beer, and then the prophets told me something, right? So you can get into a frenzy state in certain different ways, right? But all to say that you get into this altered state, wait to receive a message from the divine, receive it, and then go deliver it. And that's it. So, like I said, these people were poor. They were not considered, they're not regarded highly. They are often anonymous. One very interesting thing is that they often are referred to with both genders or kind of switching genders, especially within ancient Mesopotamia, which is an interesting thing. Like there's some sort of either cross-dressing or cross-gender, transgender identity. Some sort of third gender identity. It's never explained in the texts what's going on, but it's just an interesting thing for us to know that this was seen to be kind of perhaps a state of elevated ability to receive divine messages. But then also there was generally a little note, like whenever we have records of these messages these people would give, like a king would receive a message and send a letter to someone and explain the message that the king got. They would often include like a little lock of hair or a bit of the garment of this person, precisely because if it goes bad, or if this is bad advice or wrong advice, you want to go back and kill the person. So this was a deadly job if you didn't get it right. So all to say, like, this is kind of a, this is the world that Elijah and Elisha grow out of and are a part of. They're part of Israel's take on prophets, but prophets in Israel are a lot like this too. So there's only two in the ancient Near East outside of Israel, where kings really seem to like and kind of take note of prophets and like have like a fascination with them. One of those times was the ancient city of Mari. Here we see it's badly broken. There were French expedition that dug this up and has, as best they could, fixed it up. This is from right around the year 1800 BC. This is an image of Ishtar, who is kind of standing up and her hand is out. And then right where my finger is here, that is Zimri Lim, the king of Mari, who is receiving power to be king and the ability to rule and judge, symbolized by a staff and a little cord to measure things, that Ishtar, the goddess, is handing to him. So this is Zimri Lim of Mari. He is the king of, here I'm going to move my little face here. He is the king of this kingdom here, Mari, which is to the northwest of Babylon and Babylonia. At the time, Hammurabi was the king of Babylon. So Mari was like their enemy. The area where Mari is later becomes the kind of homeland for Assyria, which is at the time in 1800 BCE. This is well before Israel exists as a people. Nineveh up here, you can see in Asher and so on. Assyria comes to take on this whole area, and then Assyria and Babylonia become the big enemies one with another. But at this point in time, Mari and Babylon were kind of contesting each other. And then there's also this area, Yamchad, which is basically Syria, they are no longer a people at the time of what we think of as the Bible. But in any event, so Mari was this really powerful nation right around the time of Hammurabi, right around 1800 BCE. And Zimri Lim, for some reason, we don't know why, loved prophets, took them seriously, listened to them, told his governors and his family to take these folks seriously, to care about them, what their messages are, to always relay them to him. We have letters where people wrote to the king and said, "Hey, king, you always told us that we always need to tell you what these prophets say." Okay, so I saw a prophet, and here's what that prophet said, right? Here's a little image of Mari, by the way, one of the biggest cities in the world at that point in time. Some people guess maybe even 100,000 people. So it would have been a megalopolis of the ancient world, right there on the Euphrates River. And here's Hammurabi, by the way. This is Hammurabi's stela. This is the laws of Hammurabi, the code of Hammurabi, which you can see if you go to the Louvre today, or at some point in the future, go to the Louvre. Here's Hammurabi, and here's Shamash, the sun god, handing him the staff and the cord in order to make laws and so on. So Hammurabi is the one who destroys Mari and kills Zimri Lim. Sorry, Zimri. But from before Hammurabi kills Zimri Lim, we have all this information from Zimri Lim's life, preserved, in fact, because Hammurabi burns down the king's quarters, which include the king's repository of documents, which were kept in these cuneiform tablets, these clay tablets that were baked hard in Hammurabi's fire, and preserved them until today. So here's some people. I'm going to move my little head again. Here's some people digging up some of these tablets, and you can actually see one of them here. So in any event, all to say, Zimri Lim, this king of Mari, was a fascinating guy, and we can see a lot of things about his context, and a lot of things about how he treated these prophets, these messengers from the gods, from the letters that they read to him. He also calls these people crazy people, or ragimu, which means shouting people, and we've got other names from the ancient world, and it kind of seem like they're making fun of these folks. But one of the things that's great about Zimri Lim's take on prophets is that we can see that the prophets had power, at least in some way. There's one letter where Zimri Lim receives from a governor of a place called Esarhaddon. So Esarhaddon was this regional city, and the governor of that regional city sends this letter to the king Zimri Lim, and he says, "Hey, listen, you wanted to know what the prophets have to say? Here's what this guy said. The guy came to our city gates, and he said he wants a lamb. And he said there's going to be devouring." I said, okay. So we bring a lamb to him, and he assembles all the elders of the town, and then he eats the lamb raw. Now, there's a live animal, and this prophet begins to eat the live lamb. I'm imagining a bloody, disgusting scene. And then the guy says, he's talking to the city here, "You stole something from my temple." And he's speaking in the name of the God here, or the voice of the God. "You need to give it back, or there will be a devouring among you." So the governor writes to the king and says, "Hey, we got to give that stuff back we stole from the temple, because the God is mad and the God is going." So what you can see here is that this is a symbolic act the prophet is doing something in kind of the voice and name of the God in order to give a message to the people about not the distant future, but about the near future and the judgment that's going to come, because they have to do something or the God is going to get involved. This is how prophecy tends to work in the ancient world. That is, the gods are trying to give a message to somebody in charge, in power, who has authority about what they're doing wrong and what to fix. So just keep that in mind, right, as we talk about Elijah and Elisha. There's lots of other letters too, and lots of things to talk about. Maybe someday we'll do like a whole prophets in the ancient Near East or prophets in the Bible course, and we'll kind of spend some more time with these folks, but it's really fascinating. Also, the second point in time at which there was an ancient ruler who really cared about prophets comes from the Nineveh, which was the capital of the Assyrian Empire. We call it the Neo-Assyrian Empire because there was an ancient Assyrian Empire. And then Babylon, like Hammurabi's Babylon, rises in power. And then there's another Assyrian kingdom much later, and that's the Neo-Assyrian. They didn't call themselves Neo-Assyrians, right? They called themselves Assyrians. But in any event, we call it the Neo-Assyrian Empire because it was around the year 900 to around the year 600, they were a big deal, and they kind of dominated Mesopotamia. So Nineveh was their capital. By the way, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, that's Nineveh. Babylon was a word used to refer to that whole part of the world, not just the city of Babylon. It was Nineveh that had a hanging garden, a garden planted on top of the palace of the king, in order for the king to show people, hey, here's all the plants of the world. I've got them here growing in my roof. By the way, they grow better here than anywhere else, he would tell people. But in order to show his empire, this is actually where the zoo comes from and where the botanical gardens come from in modern England, a way for you to show the power of your empire by showing all of the plants that you control from all of the places that you can control, right? So around the globe. So in any event, Neo-Assyria was a very, very powerful place, and the authority was invested in the king, right? So right about the year 750 BC, here's you can see kind of this, in this grand space and so on. Here's the Hanging Gardens, or at least an artist's reconstruction of these Hanging Gardens, which displayed the wealth and power of the empire, its global nature. And here we have an image of Esarhaddon. Esarhaddon's right here, and his mother, Naqui'a-Zakutu, over here. Esarhaddon wasn't supposed to be king. Well, he was supposed to be king, and he wasn't. His father was king, Esarhaddon's father, and his father chose him to be king, even though he was the youngest of his father's children, and his older half-brothers, they both were in line before him, and were upset that he was chosen to be the crown prince. So they ended up pushing over a statue onto their dad, whose name was Sennacherib, and killed him. And then they seized power, and Esarhaddon fled because he knew they were going to try to assassinate him because he had been chosen publicly to be the heir to the king, Sennacherib. Sennacherib, by the way, the guy who got killed by the statue being pushed over, he was the guy who destroyed all of Judah and surrounded Jerusalem and besieged it during the time of King Hezekiah. So, real guy, and so Esarhaddon, the son, who was chosen to be king, but whose older brothers usurped the throne, he runs into the wilderness and he hides there. And the priestesses of Ishtar, a goddess of ancient Mesopotamia, in a temple of Ishtar in a very particular place called Arbela, today modern Erbil, which is a city that still exists today in Syria, in a very difficult place right now because of ISIS and the struggle in the north of Syria. But this was an ancient Mesopotamian town in which there was a temple of Ishtar. And in this temple, there are these priestesses of Ishtar, and they believed that Ishtar was speaking to them and telling them, giving them a message that Esarhaddon was supposed to be the true king and that he should persevere. So they send messages to him in the wilderness telling him, I am Ishtar of Arbela. I am with you. I will be with you. I have guarded you since you were an infant. And so I'm giving him messages of comfort and messages of encouragement that he needs to go back and seize the throne. He listens to them. He raises an army and attacks his brothers, who have the world's largest army at that point in time, and he miraculously wins. He attributes this to the words of Ishtar of Arbela, and he edits the words of these prophetesses, which initially were written on broken pieces of potsherds, which was like scrap paper of the ancient world. And he edited them, he had them edited into what we think of as kind of like a book. It was a clay tablet, but a clay tablet that was nicely lined and that had all these ancient prophecies that were kind of edited together, and we can read them today, and they sound an awful lot like, say, the book of Isaiah, which is contemporaneous with Esarhaddon. So one other thing that's really interesting is that this is the only ancient prophetic book that exists in the world outside of Israel. It's very short. It's shorter than Amos. So all to say is that, and it's roughly contemporaneous. It's a little bit before Isaiah, but roughly contemporaneous with Amos. So what's interesting is that in Israel, the book culture becomes the important part of the prophets, whereas the live words of the prophet remain the most important thing about ancient prophets outside of Israel. Here's, by the way, Esarhaddon's palace at Nineveh. There's one of the sculptures that Sennacherib died under, those giant Lamashtu statues, the ones with the beard and like animal legs and wings. But Ashurbanipal was the son of Esarhaddon, and here's his library where he kept all of his tablets. It was burned in a fire when Babylon rose to power. So think Nebuchadnezzar, right? So. And it burned these tablets hard, and so we have this cache of tablets that are amazing and that contain a lot of information about the prophets, especially these prophetesses of Ishtar of Arbela. Here's one of those nicely lined tablets with the edited version on it. Okay, so we also have evidence of ancient Israelite prophets outside the Bible. These are potsherds. Remember I just mentioned potsherds. These are these little pieces of pottery that are like broken pot. You break a pot, you don't throw it away, you keep it and you write on it, and then you send it. These are letters that were written right about the time of the destruction of Judah, so right around the year 597, 587, around that decade, BC. And these are letters written from increasingly worried commanders who are freaking out about the possibility of Babylonian invasion. And they, at several points, these are texts written by generals and written to other generals in Jerusalem. These are written by people who are like on the kind of border. They talk about border, like the little fires they would set to try to like warn people and so on. These are folks who inhabit one of those kind of outpost forts. One of them says, hey, did you hear what the prophet said? The prophet said that there's bad stuff in store for us and so on. So again, and there's a little quotation that looks a little bit like maybe Jeremiah. So these prophets may be referring to Jeremiah's words that Babylon will destroy Jerusalem. And they seem to be taking it very seriously as like a warning to them and so on. So there's a lot that we can gain from that. But the Israelite ostraca or broken potsherd. So ancient Israel was a part of this cultural matrix of ancient prophecy and divination. And like I said, there's certain parts of ancient Israelite culture that really didn't like divination, certain parts that accepted it at least a little bit. The idea there was that Yahweh was in some way speaking to the people through these things. But what's really interesting about prophets in ancient Israel is not that they were unique in Israel. Everyone had prophets. What's unique about ancient Israel, there's actually several features of this. Number one is that prophets were, at least in some ways, respected much more than in any other ancient or Eastern culture that we know of, at least. There's a little bit of a mention in one Transjordanian town in what would be now the Kingdom of Jordan, a related culture to ancient Israel. There's a little wall that has a writing on it from a prophet named Balaam, who's mentioned in the Bible in Numbers. But there's an actual inscription that claims to be an oracle of this person, Balaam. It's not an Israelite place. So we know that people maybe in that region of the world respected prophets more than in Mesopotamia or in Egypt or so on. But the thing we know for sure is that in ancient Israel, prophets were respected. And in fact, at least some aspects of ancient Israelite culture thought that prophets were central to the identity of who Israel was as a people and central to God's work among the people. So that seems to me to be really important. Over time, prophets evolved in ancient Israel to be associated with texts themselves, and then they kind of take on this otherworldly status. They are, in some way, speaking about even things many years in the future. By the time of Jesus, it was understood that ancient Israelite prophets were speaking thousands of years in the future or something about distant days and the ends and so on. In ancient Babylon, they didn't think that way. But even in ancient Israel, many centuries before Jesus, prophets weren't understood to talk about very distant times and dates. They were understood to talk about the near future, to judge, especially people in power, about misdeeds that they had done. Now, in other ancient cultures, the prophets were generally sent to defend the interests of whatever god or goddess that they represented, whatever temple they were at. So the goddess Ishtar, if you're a prophetess of Ishtar, you're kind of defending Ishtar's interests a bit. You're trying to stake a claim to her temple lands, or make sure the king does things that the king promised that the king would do for your temple, and so on. But in ancient Israel, it was very different. The prophets understood themselves as defenders not of a particular god's temple. In fact, the prophets yell about the temple a lot. Jeremiah says, let's tear this temple down. So the prophets were not actually associated with the temple as much as they were associated with the covenant. And this is something completely distinctive about ancient Israel. So ancient Israelite prophets understood themselves as related to Moses' covenant, and in some way calling the people to live up to the claims of the covenant. So the prophets would receive oracles from God, just like in other cultures. That was how it was understood, right? The prophets of Ishtar received messages of Ishtar and deliver them. The word in ancient Israel to talk about prophets is that, well, there's a bunch of different words. One of them is Navi, which means someone who's called out, probably. Someone maybe who delivers messages. But they're also just understood. They speak in terms of messengers. They use what's called the messenger formula, which is thus says X, X being the name of whoever you're referring to, right? Whoever you're representing. So thus says King Hammurabi. Thus says King David. That's how King David's messenger would speak. So the prophets of Yahweh say, thus says the Lord, right? The Lord in all caps is Yahweh. Thus says Yahweh. They are messengers of Yahweh. And they are understood to be primarily bringing messages of that the people are supposed to be faithful to the covenant. So covenant fidelity in the community is crucial to ancient Israelite identity. Other ancient peoples did not understand that they had a covenant with a god. So ancient Babylonian people didn't say they had a covenant with Marduk, and ancient Egyptian people didn't say they had a covenant with Horus or Ra or anything like that. That would have been demeaning to those gods, right? Because a covenant is just an agreement. It is not a theological word in the ancient world. It's not generally associated with gods. A covenant means a contract. Like you sell a house, you make a covenant. You adopt someone into your family, you make a covenant. You get married, you make a covenant, a marriage covenant, a treaty, an alliance, some sort of deal, right? A contract is another way to think about this. A covenant is a contract. God makes a contract with the people of Israel. This is unbelievably bizarre in the ancient world. It would, like I said, it would be demeaning to a god to make a contract with the people. I mean, the god is in charge, right? I mean, what does a god make contracts with people for? But the other thing is that the god wouldn't speak to a people. Marduk, the god of Babylon, doesn't speak to the people of Babylon. First of all, who is that? Poor people? I don't know if the god doesn't talk to poor people. But second of all, the god has a limited amount of time. The god wants to talk to the king, the high priest, because the god wants to get fed, right? The god wants nice things and food to come to the temple. So Yahweh understands this relationship. The God of Israel understands this relationship very differently. Yahweh's not living the high life in the temple while the peasants farm outside. Yahweh doesn't even eat the food that comes to the temple. It's the people who eat the food that come to the temple in reconciliation feasts. Yahweh speaks to all of the people in Exodus and in Deuteronomy and says, you shall not have other gods before me, and so on. That's not God talking to a king or a priest. That's God talking to the people, assembled as a people. This seems to be the first time in the ancient world that people understood a people as a people that a god would speak to. The first time we get a mention of, or at least people understanding that a god spoke to them as a people. And what God spoke to them was not just random words or not just fluffy words of acceptance. It was a covenant, a contract, saying you need to do certain things. The things about that, a lot of those laws in Exodus and Deuteronomy look a lot like the laws of the peoples around them. The thing that stands out, that's really different about the biblical witness, the thing you won't find in any ancient law code, is the concern for the weak and the vulnerable. So in Exodus chapter 22, 21 and 22, you'll see a lot of references to, first of all, the people came out of slavery in Egypt. And so God says, you're going to be with those foreigners. You're going to take care of the wanderers who come among you because you were once like them in Egypt, and I helped you. But God also says in Exodus, in the law code, don't you dare do anything mean or take advantage of those aliens, the wandering aliens. And God says, don't you dare do anything to take advantage of or harm in any way the orphans and the widows, because if they cry out to me, I will hear their cry. This is a Hebrew word, sa'ak, cry, which means a cry of like dereliction, or a cry of like being oppressed, being hurt, being taken advantage of, a cry of vulnerability. And God hears this. It's actually the earliest prayer word in the Bible in Genesis 4 with Cain and Abel. Abel's blood cries out to the ground. That's that same word. And the cries of the Israelites who have been enslaved, the Hebrews that have been enslaved in Egypt, in Exodus, reach up to God, and God pays attention, and God acts. That is the cry of the weak, the cry of the vulnerable, the cry of people who have been taken advantage of, is a core aspect of the law, of the covenant, of this agreement that Israel makes with God. And it comes back time and again. If you want to see a prophet in ancient Israel go back to this and say, hey, that contract is important, and you need to live up to it, or there's going to be some sort of change around here. Look at Jeremiah chapter 7, where Jeremiah goes to the temple and says, this thing's not where God really lives, right? But he says, more importantly, you're not taking care of the weak among you. Jeremiah quotes basically from Exodus and Deuteronomy and says, you're not taking care of the vulnerable and the weak. Instead, you're hurting them, and you're profiting off their blood and their pain. So God's going to wipe this temple clean. God's going to knock it down. This is an ancient prophet in Israel understanding his call. Jeremiah's call is primarily to call people to covenant fidelity, to be loyal to the covenant that they made to Yahweh, and that they're going to love Yahweh and to love their neighbor as themselves. Radical claim. But Leviticus 19 is where that's first found, by the way. Love your neighbor as yourself. But in that same chapter, Leviticus 19, God also says, part of the law, love the alien as yourself. So everyone, your neighbor and the alien, the one who comes from somewhere else and comes near you, anyone who comes near you, you are to love as yourself. And that's the core of the law. The prophets, Amos understands it this way. Jeremiah understands this. Micah understands that. That's all they're all mad about. The people think the prophets are all mad and upset. Yes, they're mad and upset because terrible things are happening in the world, and they are the ones who are entrusted by God to try to call people to loyalty. Because if the people don't listen and get involved and change things themselves, well, God's going to have to do it for them, and that's going to be a process of dismantling, which is going to feel painful. The other thing is who is being yelled at. Jeremiah is yelling at the priests, at the elite, at the leaders of Jerusalem. Micah, you can read this, read the book of Micah. Micah's yelling at the elite, the princes, the kings, and so on. Read the book of Amos. Amos chapter 6, he's yelling at the kings, at the elite, at the people in charge of things. This is who prophets generally spoke to, people in charge of things who had the power to change them. It's true of ancient Israel, and it's true of ancient Mesopotamia too. So in any event, this cry of the weak, though, this is what is unique. The cry of the weak based on the covenant. This is unique in the ancient world, and this is the core of ancient Israelites' prophetic tradition. The other thing that's strange is that these things get written down. As I said before, ancient people wrote things down from prophets, but in ancient Israel, they wrote obsessively. Here you see bits of leather, little long pieces of leather that have been stitched together. This is part of the Dead Sea Scrolls, part of the Great Isaiah Scroll. These giant scrolls that carried the words of the prophet to later communities. So this is a big transition within ancient Israel. But what we're going to be talking about this semester are some of the earliest named and known prophets in Israel. Nathan, of course, being an earlier one, Saul being one, or Samuel being one before that. But we're going to talk about Elijah and Elisha as two early prophets within Israel, really before the era where Israel was writing down a whole lot of stuff and preserving it. These stories probably got passed down orally for a long time and then end up being written down and preserved and passed down in a cycle. And then they get edited into the book of Kings, which we'll talk a little bit more about next time. But just to say that all of the prophets that are part of the Bible, or at least the ones that the Bible says are good prophets, right? All of them share this kind of insight that they are calling people to covenant loyalty to Israel's God, Yahweh. And holding them accountable and saying that there are going to be consequences in the near future if those things don't happen. But there's also a subset of prophets. If you think about like Jeremiah doesn't do magic, right? Isaiah doesn't do much magic. There's a couple of things Isaiah does that are kind of magical in a way, miraculous, mysterious, and so on, power. Generally, the prophets talk. Amos just talks to people. Micah just talks to people. They don't do anything special. They just say, God told me some things, and here you go. But Elijah and Elisha are a subset of ancient prophets that are often called Ish Elohim, or men of God. They are full of God's power. I'll talk about this a bit more next week, but they're understood to be explosions of God's power into this world. They are not just messengers giving words. They are in some way an extension of God's presence. And God's presence can be upbuilding and life-giving, and it can be disruptive. Disruptive primarily to evil concentrations of power. So this is why Elijah and Elisha are so strange and disruptive and explosive, but also they're full of the miraculous and of healing, and these stories are full of death as well. So we'll be kind of talking about all of that. But this a core element here that I want to get back to. Here's Moses and here's David. David's right there. Moses is above. There are two covenants that are in some tension in the Bible. In 2 Samuel 7, we see the Davidic covenant. God says to David, hey, you're from this family of David, future kings that come after you. I love you so much that you can do basically whatever you want, and I might punish you a bit, but I'm going to make sure that you remain king. This is a grace-filled covenant that you can see this being kind of the centerpiece of what Christians talk about, that God has chosen us, that God loves us no matter what, and so on. This can be abused. There is another covenant in the Old Testament that follows into the New that is really important and that God never throws away and is not done with. And the New Testament makes this clear. Jesus says, hey, I came to fulfill the law, not to get rid of it. And that is the covenant to Moses. God says to the people through Moses that if you want to be part of this community, there's standards. We need to treat each other with respect. We need to make sure that the vulnerable are not being taken advantage of. We need to make sure that orphans and widows are cared for. We need to make sure that aliens who come to visit us, no matter what, who they are, what they want, we need to take care of them. An ethic of care needs to be the center of Israel's life. And if it's not, then God is going to get involved because it's a contract. God's going to sue Israel for breach of contract, right? So these two things are in some tension because the covenant with Moses is all about how we actually have a responsibility to live and do something and live our lives well, or God's going to get involved. The covenant with David is, I love you no matter what. I think both of these are in effect for us and for ancient Israel, and there's a tension there that they need to be paying attention to and trying to live into. And the prophets are calling people to know both of these things at the same time, and often calling people to account for abusing one or both of these. So the theme then is that prophets are bearers, this kind of says bearers of the message, that prophets carry God's message to all of Israel, but primarily to people who are in some way getting in the way of God's blessing going to all people and to all nations. So the prophets then are also very contextual. They are speaking to their time and place, to people about things that they can do something about. Elijah and Elisha's message is not wait around until Jesus. Their message is there are things we need to do right now that God has told us to do. And there are things we need to know and believe that God has told us. That's especially Elijah. So we're going to talk a little about the time and place at which these prophets were understood to live. And we'll do that next time. But one takeaway for today is that prophets are everywhere in the ancient world. And there are some things we can learn about Israel's prophets from that. But what's really important is that prophets in Israel saw themselves as being called to then call Israel to embody God's mission to all of the world, to bring blessing. And with that, I hope you have a blessed week, and I'll see you next week where we talk about the book of Kings and about Elijah and Elisha's role in it. See you next time.